Hey everyone, this is the first piece from Volume 2 of the Fate of the Russian Revolution, which is titled The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, Debates, Essays, and Confrontations, edited with an introduction by Sean Madgamla. This first piece is titled Against the Stream. And it says, this is a discussion in April 1939 between Trotsky and C.L.R. James Johnson. J.R. Johnson was his pseudonym. C.L.R. James' pseudonym at this period. Hence the Johnson-Forrest tendency, which he was a part of with Raya Dunayevskaya. About how the Trotskyist groups could have been right about so many political issues in the 1920s and 30s. For example, in Trotsky's prescient warnings after 1930 of the Nazi threat in Germany, and yet remain so small as organizations, they discussed how these groups could rationally aspire to decisive political action. Trotsky. Yes, the question is, why are we not progressing in correspondence with the value of our conceptions, which are not so meaningless as some friends believe? We are not progressing politically. Yes, it is a fact which is an expression of a general decay of the workers' movement in the last 15 years. It is the more general cause. When the revolutionary movement in general is declining, when one defeat follows another, when fascism is spreading over the world, when the official, quote, Marxism, end quote, is the most powerful organization of deception of the workers, and so on, it is an inevitable situation that the revolutionary elements must work against the general historic current. Even if our ideas, our explanations are as exact and wise as one can demand, but the masses are not educated by prognostic theoretical conceptions, but by the general experiences of their lives. Is the most general explanation, the whole situation is against us. There must be a turn in the class realization, in the sentiments, in the feelings of the masses, a turn which will give us the possibility of a large political success. I remember some discussions in 1927 in Moscow after Chiang Kai-shek, bracket, Chinese bourgeois nationalist leader, end bracket, stilled the Chinese workers. We predicted this 10 days before, and Stalin opposed us with the argument that Borodin was vigilant, that Chiang Kai-shek would not have the possibility to betray us, etc. I believe that it was 8 or 10 days later that the tragedy occurred, and our comrades expressed optimism because our analysis was so clear that everyone would see it and we would be sure to win the party. I answered that the strangulation of the Chinese Revolution is 1,000 times more important for the masses than our predictions. Our predictions can win some few intellectuals who take an interest in such things, but not the masses. The military victory of Chiang Kai-shek will inevitably provoke a depression, and this is not conducive to the growth of a revolutionary faction. Since 1927, we have had a long series of defeats. We are similar to a group who attempt to climb a mountain and who must suffer again and again a downfall of stone, snow, etc. In Asia and Europe has created a new desperate mood of the masses. They heard something analogous to what we said 10 or 15 years ago from the Communist Party, they heard something analogous to what we say 10 or 15 years ago from the Communist Party, and they are pessimistic. That is the general mood of the workers. It is the most general reason. We cannot withdraw from the general historic current, from the general constellation of forces. The current is against us, that is clear. I remember the period between 1908 and 1913 in Russia. There was also a reaction. In 1905, we had the workers with us. In 1908 and even in 1907 began the Great Reaction. Everybody invented slogans and methods to win the masses, and nobody won the masses. They were desperate. In this time, the only thing we could do was to educate the cadres, and they were melting away. There was a series of splits to the right or to the left, or to syndicalism, and so on. Lenin remained with a small group, a sect in Paris, but with confidence that there would be new possibilities of a rise. It came in 1913. We had a new tide, but then came the war to interrupt this development. During the war, there was a silence of death among the workers. The Simmerwald (anti-war) and conference was a conference of very confused elements in its majority, in the deep recesses of the masses, in the trenches, and so on. There was a new mood, but it was so deep and terrorizing that we could not reach it and give it an expression. That is why the movement seemed to itself to be very poor, and even this element that met in Simmerwald, in its majority, moved to the right in the next year and the next month. I would not liberate them from their personal responsibility, but still the general explanation is that the movement had to swim against the current. Our situation now is incomparably more difficult than that of any other organization in any other time, because we have the terrible betrayal of the Communist International, which arose from the betrayal of the Second International. The degeneration of the Third International developed so quickly and so unexpectedly that the same generation which heard its formation now hears us, and they say, quote, "But we have already heard this once," end quote. Then there is the defeat of the left opposition in Russia. The Fourth International is connected genetically to the left opposition. The masses call us Trotskyists. Quote, "Trotsky wishes to conquer the power, but why did he lose power?" End quote. It is an elementary question. We must begin to explain this by the dialectic of history, by the conflict of classes, and even a revolution produces a reaction. Max Eastman wrote that Trotsky places too much value on doctrine, and if he had more common sense, he would not have lost power. Nothing in the world is so convincing as success, and nothing so repelling as defeat for the large masses. You have also the degeneration of the Third International on the one side, and the terrible defeat of the left opposition with the extermination of the whole group. These facts are 1,000 times more convincing for the working class than our poor paper with even the tremendous circulation of 5,000, like the U.S. Trotskyist and socialist appeal. We are in a small boat in a tremendous current. There are 5 or 10 boats and one goes down, and we say it was due to bad helmsmanship. But that was not the reason. It was because the current was too strong. It is the most general explanation, and we should never forget this explanation in order not to become pessimistic. We, the vanguard of the vanguard. There are courageous elements who do not like to swim with the current. It is their character. Then there are intelligent elements of bad character who were never disciplined. They always looked for a more radical or more independent tendency and found our tendency, but all of them are more or less outsiders from the general current of the workers' movement. Their value inevitably has its negative side. He who swims against the current is not connected with the masses. Also, the social composition of every revolutionary movement in the beginning is not of workers. Also, the social composition of every revolutionary movement in the beginning is not of workers. It is the intellectuals, semi-intellectuals, or workers connected with the intellectuals who are dissatisfied with the existing organizations, who find in every country a lot of foreigners who are not so easily involved in the labor movement of the country. A Czech in America or in Mexico would more easily become a member of the Fourth than in Czechoslovakia. The same for a Frenchman in the U.S. The national atmosphere has a tremendous power over individuals. The Jews in many countries represent the semi-foreigners, not totally assimilated, and they adhere to any new critical, revolutionary, or semi-revolutionary tendency in politics, in art, literature, and so on. A new radical tendency directed against the general current of history in this period crystallizes around the elements more or less separated from the national life of any country, and for them it is more difficult to penetrate into the masses. We are all very critical toward the social composition of our organization, and we must change, but we must understand that this social composition did not fall from heaven, but was determined by the objective situation and by our historic mission in this period. It does not signify that we must be satisfied with the situation. Insofar as it concerns France, it is a long tradition of the French movement connected with the social composition of the country, especially in the past, the petty bourgeois mentality, individualism on the one side and on the other an élan, a tremendous capacity for improvising. If you compare in the classic time of the Second International, you will find that the French Socialist Party and the German Social Democratic Party had the same number of representatives in Parliament, but if you compare the organizations, you will find they are incomparable. The French could only collect 25,000 francs with the greatest difficulty, but in Germany, to send 500,000 was nothing. The Germans had in the trade unions some millions of workers, and the French had some millions who did not pay their dues. Engels once wrote a letter in which he characterized the French organization and finished with, quote, "And as always, the dues do not arrive," end quote. Our organization suffers from the same illness, the traditional French sickness, this incapacity to organization, and at the same time lack of conditions for improvisation. Even so far as we now had a tide in France, it was connected with the Popular Front. In this situation, the defeat of the People's Front was the proof of the correctness of our conceptions, just as was the extermination of the Chinese workers. But the defeat was a defeat, and it is directed against revolutionary tendencies until a new tide on a higher level will appear in the new time. We must wait and prepare a new element, a new factor in this constellation. We have comrades who come to us as Neville and others, 15 or 16 or more years ago when they were young boys. Now they are mature people, and their whole conscious life they have had only blows, defeats and terrible defeats on an international scale, and they are more or less acquainted with the situation. They appreciate very highly the correctness of their conceptions, and they can analyze, but they never had the capacity to penetrate, to work with the masses, and they have not acquired it. There is tremendous necessity to look at what the masses are doing. We have such people in France. I know much less about the British situation, but I believe that we have people there also. Why have we lost people? After terrible international defeats, we had in France a tide on a very primitive and a very low political level under the leadership of the People's Front. The People's Front, I think this whole period is a kind of caricature of our February Revolution. It is shameful that in a country like France, which 150 years ago passed through the greatest bourgeois revolution in the world, that the workers' movement should pass through a caricature of the Russian Revolution. And C.L.R. James, J.R. Johnson, says, "You would not throw the whole responsibility on the Communist Party?" Trotsky says, "It is a tremendous factor in producing the mentality of the masses. The active factor was the degeneration of the Communist Party. In 1914, the Bolsheviks were absolutely dominating the workers' movement. It was on the threshold of the war. The most exact statistics show that the Bolsheviks represented not less than 3/4 of the proletarian vanguard. But beginning with the February Revolution, the most backward people, peasant soldiers, even the former Bolshevik workers, were attracted toward this Popular Front current, and the Bolshevik Party became isolated and very weak. The general current was on a very low level, but powerful, and moved toward the October Revolution. It is a question of tempo. In France, after all the defeats, the People's Front attracted elements that sympathized with us theoretically, but were involved with the movement of the masses, and we became for some time more isolated than before. You can combine all these elements. I can even affirm that many, but not all of our leading comrades, especially in old sections, by a new turn of situation would be rejected by the revolutionary mass movement, and new leaders, fresh leadership will arise in the revolutionary current. In France, the regeneration began with the entry into the Socialist Party. The policy of the Socialist Party was not clear, but it won many new members. These new members were accustomed to a large milieu. After the split, they became a little discouraged. They were not so steeled. Then they lost their not-so-steeled interest and were regained by the current of the People's Front. It is regrettable, but it is explainable. In Spain, the same reasons played the same role with the supplementary factor of the deplorable conduct of the Nin group. Andrew Nin was in Spain as representative of the Russian left opposition, and during the first year we did not try to mobilize to organize our independent elements. We hoped that we would win Nin for the correct conception and so on. Publicly, the left opposition gave Nin its support. In private correspondence, the left opposition tried to win Nin and push Nin forward, but without success. We lost time. Was it correct? It is difficult to say. If in Spain we had an experienced comrade, our situation would be incomparably more favorable, but we did not have one. We put all our hopes on Nin, and Nin's policy consisted of personal maneuvers in order to avoid responsibility. Nin played with the revolution. Nin was sincere, but Nin's whole mentality was that of a Menshevik. It was a tremendous handicap, and to fight against this handicap only with correct formulas, falsified by our own representatives in the first period, the Nins, made it very difficult. Do not forget that we lost the first revolution of 1905. Before our first revolution, we had the tradition of high courage, self-sacrifice, etc. Then we were pushed back to a position of a miserable minority of 30 or 40 men. Then came the war. I don't believe that Trotsky was in the Bolshevik wing of the party in 1905, but Johnson's C.L.R. James says, "How many were there in the Bolshevik party?" Trotsky responds, "In 1910 in the whole country there were a few dozen people. Some were in Siberia, but they were not organized. The people whom Lenin could reach by correspondence or by an agent numbered about 30 or 40 at most. However, the tradition and the ideas among the more advanced workers was a tremendous capital, which was used later during the revolution, but practically at this time we were absolutely isolated. Yes, history has its own laws, which are very powerful, more powerful than our theoretical conceptions of history. Now you have in Europe a catastrophe, the decline of Europe, the extermination of countries. It has a tremendous influence on the workers when they observe these movements of the diplomacy, of the armies and so on, and on the other side a small group with a small paper which makes explanations. But it is a question of his being mobilized tomorrow and of his children being killed. There is a terrible disproportion between the task and the means. If the war begins now, and it seems that it will begin, then in the first month we will lose 2/3 of what we now have in France. They will be dispersed. They are young and will be mobilized. Subjectively, many will remain true to our movement. Those who will not be arrested and who will remain, there may be 3 or 5. I do not know how many, but they will be absolutely isolated. Only after some months will the criticism and the disgust begin to show on a large scale, and everywhere our isolated comrades, in a hospital, in a trench, a woman in a village, will find a changed atmosphere and will say a courageous word. And the same comrade who was unknown in some section of Paris will become a leader of a regiment, of a division, and will feel himself to be a powerful revolutionary leader. This change is in the character of our period." This piece was from the 4th International, May 1941. Thank you for listening. The original conversation happened in 1939, but that was not when it was published. Or at least where this piece was extracted from, it was published in 4th International, 1941. Thank you for listening.